In this video we'll deal with Storey's ideal type of HRM. Storey in 1992 proposed 27 points of difference between personnel industrial relations practices and HRM practices. So there are 27 distinctions between what we would term personnel relations or industrial relations on the one hand and HRM practices on the other. This is quite an extensive list, and as we work our way through it, we're not going to deal with each point in great detail. We're simply going to state the differences and move on. It needs much more consideration and thought, and you need to go through each point and think about the differences yourselves and compare also what he's saying with the material in other videos that we have presented. The ideal type outlines key dimensions of policy and identifies key differences between personnel management and human resource management. So there are key differences between them, and the ideal type outlines the differences. It discusses the distinction between personnel on the one hand, personnel relationships and industrial relationships on the one hand, and HRM practices on the other. Both HRM and personnel management focus on people management. However, the approach to managing differs. The differences are listed in Storey's ideal type. So both HRM and personnel management both focus on people and on the management of people. However, the approach to managing both of them is different. Although they're looking at the same thing, they're looking at it from a different angle, and the differences are listed in Storey's ideal type. Storey expressed HRM as a set of integrated policies with an ideological and philosophical foundation. According to Storey's HRM consists of the following. Well, HRM is a cluster of beliefs and assumptions. The HRM department make assumptions about the employees and about what is the right way to implement, let's say, the corporate strategy, or what's the right way to vary some particular function, or the right way to move forward. It has a set of assumptions, a set of beliefs, and it tries to orientate the workforce to achieve certain outcomes. Strategic management of people in decision making. Well, HRM tries to achieve the strategic objectives of the organization, and therefore it's looking at strategic management of people, how to use the workforce most effectively, how to assign the workforce to tasks, and to achieve the required outcomes. Line managers are essential in communicating and delivering HR outcomes. In a sense, there is a layer of management, senior management, that set the direction for the business and deal with the much bigger areas of setting out the strategic plan, and looking at investment decisions, looking at the product and marketing decisions, and so on. And then it all filters down in the organization down to line management, and this is the level of management that interfaces with the workforce, with the employees. And the line management is really the go-between, the interface. Excuse me. It's the interface, or the contact point between management and employees. So line managers are essential in communicating and delivering HR outcomes. The application of levers to build the employment relationship. So HRM sets out how to build the employment relationship. It sets out the policies that will be followed. It will, of course, negotiate with the employees. It may engage in collective bargaining, for example, with the employees, or it may meet the employees on a regular basis, on perhaps a rather informal basis, to enable the employees to feed back to the organisation their views. But essentially, these are the characteristics of the HRM department. Now, when we look at the Storey points for the ideal HRM, what we do when we get is a table, and it's a very extensive table, and you can see it's just set up on the slide before us with 3 headings: the dimension, the personnel or industrial relations view, and the HRM view. Now, because of the extent of this approach, the type of categorization and distinctions that are being made, it's a very detailed approach, and I don't propose to go through it in that much detail. It would make this an extremely long video. So what I'm going to do is set out the points, ask you to make a note of these, reflect on them, discuss them, and get an understanding for each distinction, and how each distinction made between personal or industrial relations on the one hand and HRM on the other, how each distinction draws out the lines of responsibility and the orientations of the 2 approaches. So we clearly understand the difference between employee relations, personal relations, personnel management, and on the one hand, and HRM on the other. So let's see how it works. So we start with beliefs and assumptions. So let's look at the differences based on beliefs and assumptions. First of all, on the contract. Well, for personnel management, there will be careful delineation of written contracts. The written contracts will be very carefully worded and set out. But for HRM, the contract is to go beyond the contract. The aim is to move forward. So in a sense, the contract is having a wider contract, having a wider understanding with the employee that what is written on paper, the contract, is, if you like, it's the basis upon which the business moves forward. But really, there is an expectation that the employee will be flexible and will participate in policies and plans from the organisation, and will develop with the organisation. The organisation is not seen as a static entity. It evolves, and the relationship between the employees and the management should also evolve, should go beyond the contract. Rules. Well, the importance for devising clear sets of rules. So personal management will set out the rules. This is what needs to be done, and this is the code of conduct we expect, and these are the routines of the business which must be followed, and so on. But with HRM, there's a can-do outlook, and it's almost an impatience with rules. Rules are good. Rules give guidelines, but the workforce should really be looking towards developing with the organisation and having that flexibility if required. So the rule may be to work from 9 to 5, but sometimes a job needs to be completed and an extra quarter of an hour, half hour may be required to meet the target and give customer satisfaction, and there should be some flexibility on the part of all involved to try and accommodate what the customer wanted, perhaps an early delivery or delivery that evening. So there should be a more flexible approach, not one rigidly adhering to a set of rules. Guide to management action. Well, the guide to management action in terms of personnel management are the procedures. What needs to be done in certain circumstances? What does the rule book state? What are the procedures? Whereas with HRM is, what does the business need? What's best for the business? So it may be that HRM starts with the personnel management set of data, the rule books and the contract and the rules and so on, but it's looking for more flexibility. It's looking to develop an approach which accommodates what the business needs. Behavior referent. Well, the behavior that's expected will be an adjustment to norms and customs and practices. This is how it's done. This is how this business works. This is the way we work. And employees accommodate that and come to work in the business knowing that these are the norms. This is what's expected. And these are the customs. And the employee fits in with that type of almost societal structure, rules, customs, norms. But then the HRM view is to look at the mission of the business, look at the values of the business. Where's the business going? What does the business project? What does the business believe in? Where does it want to be? What's the mission? And it's trying to achieve that. So it's not a focus on trying to accommodate the norms and the customs of the business. That's not why the employees are there. The employees are there, according to the HRM view, to promote the mission of the business, to achieve what the business is trying to get out of particular changes and particular ways of working. So managerial task vis-a-vis labour. Well, the managerial task is, from a personal management view, is monitoring the workers to make sure that they are doing what's expected of them. They're doing it safely, but at the same time they are being productive. They are doing the tasks. With HRM, it's nurturing. It's trying to get the employees to work alone, work without supervision, to be engaged, to be motivated, to apply themselves to the organization and to try to meet the targets that are set, to work flexibly, to work with initiative. So on the one hand, it's people working because they're being monitored and being watched, being controlled. Or on the other hand, they are freely working and trying to achieve the best with minimal supervision, or perhaps no supervision, but they are doing it because they believe in the organization, they subscribe to its ideals, they are working to fulfill the expectations that the organization has given them. And it shows a more collaborative way of working. There is not a distinction then between labour and the business. It's a blurring. Both are trying to achieve the same things. The nature of the relationships, well, for the personnel management, it would be more pluralist. It's accommodating a different group of people, the employees. So the business is the management, or one group, and the employees are another group, but they're working together to try to achieve the outcomes. Whereas the HRM view is unitarist, which means they are ideally lined up. They see things the same. They are moving in the same direction. They are like a single entity. The employees subscribe to the same values and views as do management. And of course we could look into why that's the case, and we can look into each one of these points in much more detail and try to figure out why there is this assumption or that assumption. But With the unitarist view, for example, um, it simply means that the employees understand the direction of the business, the strategic direction, and agree with it. So they're working towards the same outcome. Conflict, well, with conflict it's institutionalized. The There could be a trade union organization involved, or a works council, or there's some way of dealing with conflict. There's a mechanism, and the chances are it's a written mechanism. It's a rule book again. What happens in the event of? What is the recommended course of action? With HRM, it's de-emphasized. In other words, it's the conflict is looked at in the context of, let's say, collective bargaining, but it's also caught up with the policies and the procedures of HRM. It's caught up by looking at the effectiveness of motivational programs and schemes, with looking at the effectiveness of communications channels, looking at ways in which the employees are taken into account when changes are being proposed, and the type of consultation that is undertaken by the organisation. So it's trying to anticipate conflict and reduce the conflict or eliminate the conflict by setting appropriate policies in advance. Before the issue arises, deal with it. And it's dealt with by having the type of involvement that the HRM approach seems to suggest, the ones we've talked about earlier. The strategic aspects, well, key relationships is to look at labour management. That would be the personnel view, looking at labour management and making sure that labour is properly working and effectively working, and ideally positioned within the organisation so that there is efficiency. But in terms of HRM, the key relationship is with the customer. It's what the customer gets. That's the issue. Then it looks at initiatives. Well, initiatives with personal management are piecemeal. Initiatives come up from time to time. Someone proposes some change and it's considered. It just happens from time to time. It's piecemeal. Whereas with HRM, it's integrated. The initiatives are sought by the management. They're sought out. The management's constantly looking for initiatives and improvements, and it's looking at ways in which the whole workforce can be carried along with the initiative, so that there is no disagreement and no issues arise. So HRM would look at towards programs of training and making sure there's proper induction programs, and also inviting the employees to come up with ideas, come up with improvements, and feed those back. So it's a much more integrated process. Initiatives are part and parcel of what HRM does. It deals with initiatives, whereas with personnel management, it's piecemeal. It happens from time to time. The corporate plan, well, the personnel management is marginal to the corporate plan. The personnel management, they're more dealing with getting the workers in place, recruiting, the induction program for new workers, assigning the workers to job roles, making sure they're working, making sure they're being monitored and checked, and so it's much more that type of work. So they're not really that focused on the corporate plan. They're more dealing with the employees, making sure the employees are effectively working. Whereas with HRM, HRM and the corporate plan go together. The corporate plan is what the organization wants to achieve, the direction in which it's moving and what it wants to achieve. And to do that, it must have a dedicated workforce, a workforce that are committed to the same type of achievements and the same type of targets. So to HRM, the corporate plan is central. It's central to HRM. But with personnel management, they're more focused on assigning the right workers to the right tasks, making sure the tasks are completed, the workers are monitored and are applying themselves effectively, and so there's a big distinction. The speed of decision, well, for personnel management, it's slow. The need to consult the rule books, the need to find out what the issues are and when a decision needs to be made, and it's usually quite a slow process. With HRM, it's fast. HRM is much more flexible in that sense. They're able to make the decisions very quickly because they understand the importance of speed, of having good decisions, but decisions delivered in a timely manner. For line management, well, the management role is, in terms of personnel management, is transactional leader to make sure that the various tasks are carried out. And the line management is to ensure that the employees carry out those tasks, that they transact, in a sense, that the transactions that are required are carried out. With HRM, it's transformational. It's a changing process. It's getting the employers in position, getting them to work on particular tasks, and at the same time dealing with them in terms of their motivation. They can work with minimal supervision. They have the same outlook as the business, and they're looking for innovations and changes in the way they work and feeding this back to management all the time, looking for improvements. So it's transformational. Key managers, well, in terms of line management, of course, the specialist, the personnel specialist will be the key managers. But in terms of HRM, it will be the general business and the line managers. So HRM permeates the organization. It flows throughout the organization. The line managers are trained in the context of what the organization wants and the way to bring this about through the effective use of personnel, but in engaging with the personnel, encouraging the personnel, making sure there are adequate motivations and that there is good communications channels. So the HRM is much more being involved, much more general business, line managers. All of the structure knows what's required in terms of HRM and apply themselves to try and get that done. Communication, well, with personnel management, it's indirect. The personnel management come up with a set of rules or a set of ideas or wish to communicate something. It'll be discussed, perhaps written into the rule book, and communicated to perhaps some senior departmental manager or whoever within the organization. It's indirect. It goes via someone else. But with HRM, it could go directly to the employee. So communications could be directly with the employee. The employees perhaps are invited to a training program or to some sort of skill updating program, and they have direct inputs from the HRM department. So it's direct in terms of HRM. Standardization. Well, for personnel management, there's high standardization. The rules are set out, so they're all specified. With HRM, there's low standardization. The rules are almost not rules. The rules are flexible. So the organization is looking at what is required in the market, what's required by the customer, and looking at how it has to vary the product and vary its work routines to make sure it has a competitive advantage and it can survive in the market. So it can't have the luxury of standardization. It must be flexible according to market conditions. So it's as if personnel management runs according to some standardized set of rules, and that's almost irrespective of the conditions the company finds itself in. With HRM, the organization is flexible and it bends according to what's happening in the marketplace. Prized management skills. Well, with personnel management, it's negotiation. The personnel managers negotiate and try to figure out what is the best course of action for the organization, and then perhaps modify their rules and procedures according to the negotiations. But with HRM, it's facilitation. The HRM approach is to talk to the employees, try to figure out what the employees would like to see done, what they want, to try to facilitate that if possible. But if they can't, then engage in discussions with them, perhaps have further talks, have training sessions, have explanations, and work with the employees to find an outcome, which is facilitation. They come to an understanding between them that this is the best course of action. Selection. Well, it's a marginal task for the personnel. The selection with personnel is to find out what the job specification is, what are the skills and competencies required, and to perhaps try and recruit the personnel on that basis. Whereas with HRM, it's looking for integrated key tasks. It's looking to see what the employee can do, what their training is, what are their core competencies, what are their experiences, their qualifications, can they work as a part of a team, can they be integrated into the business effectively, what's their approach to future training. So it's a much more detailed approach, and it's ongoing. It's not just at the time of recruitment. This is something that runs continuously within the organization. Pay, well, it's job evaluation for personnel management. Personnel management know what certain jobs, what pay should be associated with certain jobs, and that's what they work towards. Whereas with HRM, it's performance related. How good does the worker perform? How well do they perform? What's their outcome? What is their productivity? What's their application? Can they work alone? Can they work with minimal supervision? Can they be a part of the organization? Can they work well as teams, or as a member of a team, I should say? So with HRM, it's much more performance related, where with personnel management there is a rate for the job, and it's administered in that way. For conditions, there's separate negotiations with personnel management. So conditions of employment will be negotiated with the personnel management. But with HRM, there's a harmonization. There's an understanding that the workers will communicate with each other and they'll communicate with the organization. The employees, the workers, will want certain conditions of employment, health and safety, good environment, good working conditions, perhaps some fringe benefits associated with their pay, holiday entitlement, and so on. And it's trying to harmonize that across the organization so that there is equity in the approach of the business with its dealings with employees, and that employees are not discriminated against and they're all dealt with fairly. Labour management, well, collective bargaining contracts for personnel management. With HRM, it's moving more towards individual contracts. It's looking at each worker in terms of his or her contribution to the organisation, their value to the organisation. Some workers will be highly motivated to acquire new skills, will engage in follow-up training and education, and will apply themselves much more effectively to the organisation. And it's felt that those workers should be rewarded accordingly. So it's not as if everyone should be treated exactly the same. Some workers will be making extra efforts, and they should be identified and rewarded. Trust of relationships with stewards. Well, regularized through facilities and training. So for personnel management, the relationship between the employees and the management is normally regularized through the facilities of the organization, through training, and what they're trying to deal with is looking at how the employees see the organization. Do they see it as supportive, or do they see it as something which they have to deal with because that's their livelihoods? So training can help, and it could be through the use of facilities, perhaps the use of fringe benefits within the organisation that builds up a trust between the employees and the management. The employees see the management as trying to facilitate their lifestyles, trying to help their lifestyles, trying to put in place safe working conditions, good conditions of employment, some fringe benefits, and has also engaged in training with them. But with HRM, it's a much more comprehensive package, trying to get the employees to see what the organisation is doing, to inculcate this through repetitive training schemes and explanations and suggestions, and with detailed contact with the employees. So there's no need to rely on agents in between, to rely on, let's say, union stewards or on particular lines of management to be the only conduit back to the management. The employees are able to feed back almost directly to senior management through training programs, through suggestions, through contacts, through negotiations, and therefore the individual parts of the organisation are not that necessary. There's no requirement to have a rigid structure for the employees to go through. The employees, for example, can only talk to the next layer of management, to say the line management. The line management could only talk to the next layer of management. That's not the case with HRM practice. With HRM practice, the employee can usually gain access to contacts with almost any line of management through suggestions, through meetings, through training schemes, and so on. So it's much more involved. Job categories and grades. Well, with personnel management there are many grades. Different types of jobs have different grades. In organizations there will be, generally speaking, many types of jobs to be carried out, and each one may carry a different grade and a different set of terms and conditions, different remuneration. But with HRM there's more flexibility, so there are fewer grades, fewer job categories. The employees know that has to be done, this has to be done, so let's just do it, and it's done. So it's not as if everything has to be itemized. Every task has to be itemized with a separate tariff or a certain remuneration or a certain set of procedures that needs to be carried out, and documentation completed and supervision that it is carried out. With HRM it's different. With HRM it's this needs to be done, that needs to be done, let's do this, that, and do the core task as well, and it's finished. There are fewer categorizations. People are, the employees are more willing to complete the task because they know it has to be done. And if it's not done, the organization will ultimately suffer, and the organization will suffer anyway if everything has to be itemized and managed. It'll sap the resources of the organization. Communications. Well, with personnel management there's a restricted flow of communications. The employees may speak to their line managers, they may request a meeting with personnel management, and it's slow, could be bureaucratic, it's not at a high level, it's very formalized in some respects. These are the procedures that must be followed, and that's the way it operates. Whereas with HRM it's much more fluid. The employees are able to speak to the line managers, but they could speak to other managers, or they could go to the HRM department and have a meeting there and have a grievance. They can deal with it, or have a suggestion which is perhaps aimed at improving something within the organization, or even just to find out what the organization's views are under certain circumstances. For example, compassionate leave or some issue of this type. Job design. Well, with personnel management it's the division of labour. That workers are assigned to certain tasks, they perform the tasks over and over, and they become more skilled in doing so. It's an application of the division of labour. Whereas with HRM there's much more emphasis on teamwork. If an employee is away ill, for example, other members of the team can perform the task with designated roles. If a member of staff is away ill or whatever, away from the workplace, that task will not be completed. So with personnel management it's much more rigid. With HRM there is flexibility, teamwork. Other members of the team can step in and perform the task. Conflict handling. Well, with personnel management it normally is to reach temporary truces and try to find long-term solutions from there. Or with HRM is to manage the whole climate in which work takes place, manage the culture so that the employees understand what's required of them, and the employees are persuaded that the route that the organization is taking is the appropriate one, and they subscribe to it. So there's just less conflict, or there should be less conflict. Training and development, controlled access to courses for personnel management. In fact, personnel management may only train certain workers or certain employees who they have picked as suitable for training. With HRM, there's more emphasis on widespread training throughout the organization, greater understanding throughout the organization at all levels. So with HRM, it's this idea of a learning company. That the business is learning, the employees are learning, and it's not so restricted. The foci of attention for interventions. With personnel management, it's personnel procedures. That's where the personnel department becomes involved, when personnel procedures need to be looked at. But with HRM, it's wide-ranging. It's the cultural, the structural, and personnel strategies. So with HRM, it's much wider, looking at education, training, development, mentoring, looking at all the issues associated with health and safety, and collaboration with the workforce in meeting targets and meeting policies. It's much wider for HRM, but with personnel management it may be restricted to looking at their procedures and trying to implement their procedures. So these are the 27 points mentioned by Storey. As you can see, they are very important. At the same time, they're quite complex. If we were to try and summarize these, well, almost impossible, but if we were to try and do it, what seems to come out is that the personnel management column is much more rigid. It's much more rule governed. There are sets of procedures that the personnel managers have. These procedures may be updated, of course, and change over time, but there's a set of procedures, and it's like having a rule book, management by a rule book. What happens in the event of? Well, the book says that what we do in this case is 1, 2, 3, 4. So there's the answer has been anticipated and written. In this event, this is what happens. So it's much more applying the rules. So it leads to an inflexibility. With HRM, it's understanding the direction of the business, the corporate direction, and having a flexible approach to the labour force, training the labour force, explaining the policy of the business, getting understanding and agreement with the labour force, so that the labour force come on side. The labour force are on the side of management. They agree with what is happening because they understand it. They understand the direction in which the business is travelling, and they know it's in their interest as well. And there are fewer disputes, greater flexibility, more team working, more emphasis on training and commitment, and suggestions from the employees can flow easily within the organisation. There are good communications channels that are open, and the employees know this. And there is less need to have rules and an emphasis on rigidly following the rules. There is a flexibility. There is face-to-face contact. And the HRM department takes it on itself to ensure it's a safe working environment, that the jobs are enriched so that the employees can experience different tasks. There's job rotation. They're not bored in the workplace. They're able to speak to management, get their concerns looked at and considered. So it's a much more involved approach to employee relations. With personnel, it's a question of following the rules. So I think that's what comes out of the Storey 27 points. Obviously, it's much more elaborate as put forward by Storey, and each point makes a distinction. And it's an extremely well worked piece of analysis to be able to work out that there are 27 points of distinction. It's a very elaborate list. But if we were to aggregate those, I think what I've just said about the distinction between HRM and personal management would apply. So it's important you go back and have a look at these and try to understand the distinction between personnel management, industrial relations, that sort of area, and what is meant by HRM on the other side. But that's all we're going to deal with in this session. That's the Storey reference, so we're going to leave it at that and say thank you for watching.